in India, the research analysis wing, have never opened an official file. However, if you're creative and innovative as a researcher, you can find out information.
Russians, the Soviets, everyone was trying to do propaganda in India, including not just disseminating news and often fake news. So fake news is something that goes back quite a bit, forgeries, etc. Not just that, but also spreading literature, because I remember growing up seeing Soviet books, Soviet magazines, Soviet beautifully produced books for children.
I think, again, Indira Gandhi's relationship with Western intelligence and even with Soviet intelligence is quite complicated. George Bush in the 1980s, when Indira Gandhi was making great play of a foreign hand in the Punjab and how they were stoking up the Khalistan movement and creating problems for India. Bush wrote very candidly to our account saying, look, we are not doing this. I've told you we're not doing it. I can give you my guarantee this is not happening. We are not fomenting or stirring up insurrection, agitation in the Punjab. I give you my word this is happening.
Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Sidharth Bhatia. If there's one thing that is common between governments in India, cutting across ideological lines, it is the allegation that sinister agencies from abroad are operating in this country. Mrs Indira Gandhi used to refer to the foreign hand, which was allegedly interfering in India, and now the Narendra Modi government constantly invokes external forces every time things go wrong, including in railway accidents. Who are these shady elements? One academic has tried to unravel that mystery in his new book on international spying agencies operating in India over the decades, even before independence. Paul McGarr teaches at King's College London and has already written one book on the Cold War in India, Britain, and the United States. His research interests focus on security and intelligence outside the Anglosphere, clandestine diplomacy, that's a lovely word, I like it, and covert propaganda. His first book advanced new socio-cultural explanations for how and why the Cold War in South Asia evolved the way it did. Dr. McGarr's latest book is Spying in South Asia, Britain, the United States, and India's Secret Cold War. He shows that even while politicians were critical of the foreign hand, Indian and Western spying agencies were working with each other and cooperating. He joins us today to discuss his new book, which I must say is packed with research and information and some fascinating facts and insights about a world that is usually hidden from public sight. Dr. Paul McGarr, welcome to the Wire Talks.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's very kind.
My first question is, it's an obvious question to start with. Why and how did you get interested in the subject of spying as an academic?
That's a really good question. Thank you. Really, it's because I was interested in diplomacy to begin with. So my first book is really engaging with India on a diplomatic level. So thinking about the wider diplomatic relations between India, the United States, and the United Kingdom, really from 1947 through to the end of the Cold War period. And while I was writing and researching that book, I came across lots of information that I wasn't aware of that engage with the notion of secret intelligence and how intelligence agencies, India's RAW, the Intelligence Bureau, but also the Central Intelligence Agency and Britain's MI6 or Secret Intelligence Service, how they were a really important part of that diplomatic picture, but no one had really written about it. I couldn't quite squeeze all of that information I'd found in archives in India and the UK and the US into the first book, but it struck me as a really important story that hadn't been told. So that really was the genesis for the second book.
Yeah, I mean, there have been writings on academic writings on spying, and there have been a lot of popular books or books written by former Secret Service agents in Britain, in America. I remember the number of books written about the Cambridge Five, and so on and so forth. So, did you think that by linking it with diplomacy, it would take a different kind of turn?
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. It's really important point to make that literature on spying and espionage has grown tremendously, I think, over the last 20 or 30 years, largely because the access to material information in archives has become it's become much more available to the average researcher. So the opening of records has facilitated that to some extent. Not all, obviously, not all intelligence agencies are as open as others, but that's created a sort of culture, I think, both in popular literature but also in academic literature around engaging with spies. And spies are always an interesting story. You mentioned the Cambridge Five, and the sort of they always tend to titillate people's attention when we talk about spies and espionage. But I think, interestingly, in South Asia, although of late lots of former Indian intelligence officers have begun to publish memoirs for the first time, which are really interesting, there hasn't been a sort of rigorous academic examination of how intelligence was really important in the formation of India as a nation state and its development during the 1950s, 60s and 70s, through to the end of the Cold War. So I was really interested in saying that this is a really important story. It hasn't really been told, I don't think, significantly or in any depth. And it's something I think people would want to know about. It's a really important component of India's evolution into a modern nation state.
Oh, you mentioned archives have become available, but actually that was going to be my next question. Anything to do with spying and espionage is by its very definition secretive. How did you get hold of the archives, especially archives which governments do not want you to get hold of? And not just that, you have quoted conversations that were held inside closed rooms.
That's right. It is a challenge. So just in terms of the methodology of conducting research when you're doing espionage and intelligence agencies, it obviously is problematic. So, for example, in the UK, the records of MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service, have never been opened. So there's not a single file on MI6 that's available to British researchers. Similarly, in India, the Research Analysis Wing have never opened an official file. However, if you're creative and innovative as a researcher, you can find out information. So, for example, in the British archives, I found lots of files from MI6 that were hidden away in treasury files or other government files that had received that information from intelligence services and put it into their own files and hadn't had it weeded out. And similarly in India, I did quite a lot of work at the Nehru Memorial Library in New Delhi, fantastic institution, great place to do research, just a beautiful place to do research as well. So that's inspiring in and of itself. But people like P. N. Haksar's papers are packed full of information from R.N. Cow and from the Research Analysis Wing. So you have to go a roundabout route, but you can find out information, I think, from National Archives. The information's there. It's just a question of going a sort of circuitous route to really find that information. Certainly you can't approach this issue head on because there is a real block on access to information by the services themselves.
I mean, you can't walk into archives and say, I would like to know about your files on espionage, right? Am I right? But you can walk into.
You're right. You can try, but I don't think you'll get very far. So all those files, unfortunately, are listed usually on sort of catalogs. But when you try to access them, you're told, "I'm sorry, that's classified and you can't access it." So it can be really frustrating as a researcher. But I think you just need to be creative, as I said, and innovative, and think, well, okay, if I can't get there directly, how do I go around the back door? How do I find another way of accessing that information? And it's not, you can't access everything, but I think usually if you're creative and imaginative enough, you can find enough information to tell a story. So I think, as with any historical book, there's always more to say. There's never a definitive work that's ever written. More information will always come out. But I think it's important to tell the story as far as you possibly can at any given point in time. So that was really the sort of the motivating factor of this book, that there was enough information available in various places to put together a coherent story.
So it must have taken you quite a bit of time to finish this. But,
yeah,
there was some research left over from your first book, you're saying.
Absolutely, and that's a really important point, a really well-made point. I think it takes time. So if you can't access things directly, then going a sort of a more creative route. The problem is it does take lots of time. So fortunately, I think absolutely right. It's really important to emphasize that a lot of the material I collected was during my first book. So my first book took about sort of 5 or 6 years to write and research. But during that process, I collected lots of information that was really valuable for the second book. Second book, again, 5 or 6 years to research and write. So longer, really, in terms of the first book. But having a sort of basis of information that was really important. But it is really, you have to be patient. and you have to be sort of determined, really, if you're researching intelligence, because it's quite a long process often, to accumulate enough information to tell a meaningful and coherent story. But it's also exciting. I think, as you mentioned before, there's nothing really more exciting than going to an archive and finding information on an intelligence service that no one's really ever seen before, or really sheds a new light on how that service operated and the relationships it had with other countries. So I still get a massive thrill out of going to an archive and finding a document signed by R and Cow and initialed by Indira Gandhi, and you think, wow, that's really interesting. That's really important. No one's ever really published that, or no one's ever really sort of engaged with that in a public forum before. So it's a huge thrill still.
Yeah, I noticed that in the last couple of questions, you mentioned the word creative quite a few times, but I'll let that go for the time being. That's your personal and professional secret. Tell me, this is all archives based. Have you talked to anyone? Did you manage to get experts to talk to, or practitioners?
I did speak to some practitioners, both Indian practitioners who were extremely helpful, and also practitioners in the United Kingdom and some former members of the Central Intelligence Agency as well. I didn't use interviews too much in the book to the foreground. I didn't quote interviews, largely because former intelligence officers are quite reluctant to go on the record, particularly when they're dealing with sensitive issues. And there's a sort of equity in intelligence records. People are very cautious about revealing information that might compromise a source or might compromise someone who's worked with them on a basis of trust. So I was very cautious about using that interview data unless people have made that publicly available, which I would quote in the book. I tended to use it as background information. Also, I was also very conscious of the fact that, we have to trust people and take them on goodwill. But these guys are intelligence officers. Their job is to dissemble and to create narratives that aren't necessarily true. So I think we, as historians and researchers, we always have to approach what they tell us with an abundance of caution to make sure and to triangulate that and cross-check it as much as we possibly can, because they may have a particular narrative. And obviously there are issues around oral history as well. Most of the book I was writing was dealing with events going back to the 1940s. So even if you're interviewing people who were active in the 1950s, 60s and 70s, their memories may be impaired. It may be difficult for them to remember things accurately, even if they wanted to. So yeah, I did use oral history, and it was interesting, but mainly as background information. I always wanted to substantiate any information I gleaned from an individual with really hard archival records to make sure that was accurate.
You've been mentioning the British archives and the Indian ones. Did you get access to the CIA archives or American archives? Because they have the rule that things open up after 30 years, sometimes, not often, or not always, and they may be even redacted. Did you go to the United States to look at the archives there?
I did, and actually the American archives are amazing. They are extremely useful for researchers. Not only the National Archives in Washington, so the National Archives in Washington do contain lots of information on the Central Intelligence Agency. That's a surprising amount of information, actually. And the Central Intelligence Agency also has a system called CREST, where it declassifies its own records, which are really interesting. So CREST is able to give researchers a real access into interesting CIA papers and reports. So in fact, the Central Intelligence Agency has made more information publicly available than any other intelligence agency I think I've encountered. Also in the United States, presidential libraries are really useful assets. So every president, once they've left office, creates their own library full of their own personal papers while they're in the White House. They are a treasure trove of information, because often, although they're managed by the US National Archives, lots of information gets into the presidential archives that might otherwise not make it into a formal state archive. So I found some really interesting correspondence, for example, in Texas, in the George Bush archive, in College Station in Texas, which was correspondence between George Bush when he was vice president of the United States in the 1980s and R.N. Cow. And that was fascinating. It was all about the Punjab and what was happening in the Punjab in the 1980s. Amazing to see that correspondence. So it can be a treasure trove of information that's really important.
Yeah, well, I'll come to that conversation later on, and their friendship, or their at least whatever passes for friendship in the spying world, but I'll come to that. Was India an arena of Cold War politics and Cold War spying and activity? Because you mentioned propaganda also. So was India crucial arena for that kind of, politicking over the Americans trying to put one over the Soviets saying this is our backyard, or the Soviets were quite convinced that India was on their side, and the Americans saying that India shouldn't go over to communism. So was India a theater of that sort?
Very much so. Sorry, I got a frog in my throat. India was a very important theatre of the Cold War generally, but I think particularly the intelligence Cold War. And that's a story that hasn't really been told, which is one of the reasons behind my book, really, to just recover the fact that India was incredibly important to the United States and to the Soviet Union and to the United Kingdom and other powers, in fact, in terms of Cold War intelligence. I think there are many reasons for that. First, Indian non-alignment. So the, sorry, got a frog in my throat. Indian non-alignment is really important. So India represented this neutral Cold War space in which New Delhi as a capital, and New Delhi was often referred to as the Berlin of the East. And I think that was because Soviet citizens, American citizens, citizens of the United Kingdom, I'm talking here journalists, politicians, diplomats, intelligence officials, businessmen, could all operate freely in a democratic society in New Delhi. They had freedom of movement, freedom of expression, big diplomatic missions in the Indian capital. So the fact that India was a space, a neutral sort of space in which East and West could meet within an arena outside of Europe was incredibly important. So I think lots of British, American and Soviet intelligence officers have gone on record saying New Delhi was really crucial because we had interaction with our opposite numbers we didn't have anywhere else. So although the Intelligence Bureau of India was a very effective counterintelligence service and monitored that interaction, and the fact that it took place on such a large scale and over such an extended period was really, really important, I think, in terms of the Cold War. And just generally, intelligence services of Britain, the United States and the Soviet Union really saw India as a really valuable Cold War prize. So India's latent economic strength, its manpower, its strategic location, geostrategically, were all seen as really critical in the Cold War period. So certainly under Dwight Eisenhower in the United States and John F. Kennedy, India was seen as a tremendous Cold War prize that if the West couldn't win over in terms of formal alignment with the West, certainly they needed to deny that space to the Soviet Union. So it was seen as a tremendously important strategic prize in the Cold War. And again, we're thinking in contemporary context about China. So the Eisenhower administration and the Kennedy administration really saw India as an important buffer to Chinese ambitions in Asia and more widely, even globally. And that's going back to the 1950s, 1960s. So lots of parallels between today and the United States wanting to utilize India as an ally against Chinese expansion.
You know, I'm kind of jumping the gun, but later on in the book, somewhere you talk about propaganda. And I think every country, the two major Western powers at the time, Britain and United States, and here the Russians, the Soviets, everyone was trying to do propaganda in India, including not just disseminating news and often fake news. So fake news is something that goes back quite a bit, forgeries, etc. Not just that, but also spreading literature, because I remember growing up seeing Soviet books, Soviet magazines, Soviet beautifully produced books for children sold at throwaway prices. So all that was going on, and each one the United States had a USIS, which was a kind of propaganda disseminating arm here. So it was to that extent, the Americans and the British were so worried, you're saying in your book, that India would topple over to communism.
Yeah, absolutely. The propaganda war in India was really significant, and again, it's been sort of underwritten, I think, in the literature addressing the Cold War and certainly the intelligence Cold War. So British and American officials were really concerned by an explosion of cheap, well-produced Soviet literature in India, really from the mid-1950s onwards. And actually the proliferation of that literature in Indian railway stations and bookstores and the accessibility of that literature really did worry British and American diplomats stationed in New Delhi and elsewhere across India, and was a driving force really for the introduction of the Information Research Department into India. So I mentioned that the Information Research Department, which is a sort of shadowy propaganda agency linked to the British Foreign Office, but also close association association with Britain's MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service, had sort of operated in India from the 1940s onwards, late 1940s onwards, but hadn't really had a permanent presence. But it was Britain's High Commissioner to India in the early 1960s, a guy called Sir Paul Gore Booth, who was so concerned that every time he walked out of his office and went to a newsstand or a railway station, there was Soviet literature everywhere, and he was really concerned by this. He actually asked for the Information Research Department, this covert propaganda organization, to establish a permanent presence in India to try and counter Soviet propaganda. So there's a real concern about that. And the IID operation in India, which began in the early 1960s and ran through to the sort of mid 1970s, was probably the longest and most impactful covert intelligence operation run by Britain in India through the entire Cold War period. And it was focused on this need to counter what it regarded as insidious Soviet propaganda that it really worried would influence and impact Indian population and tilt them towards communism. Obviously that never happened, and it was an overblown threat, but it was a real and present concern for British diplomats, I think. And certain events made that seem really credible. So, for example, in 1957, in the election of a communist state government in Kerala, really sent shockwaves through Washington and London, and sort of, encouraged and amplified that need to counter what it regarded as a potentially worrying trend towards communism within India.
Looking back, I think it may have been a case of a radar under every bed, because that's the Americans were so worried about communists, and so were the British, and it got exaggerated in a country like India, where you say that India may become communist tomorrow because the Soviets are operating here and Kerala has just voted in a communist government. Because you've devoted almost a full chapter to Krishna Menon,
yes,
who was considered by the British, at least, who had seen him from early on in their country. He studied there, he lived there, and he was the High Commissioner to Britain from India, as not just a closet communist, but a full-blown communist. He wasn't, and the fear of communism must have been so palpable, because I was fascinated to read your chapter on Krishna Menon. He was, when I read it, he looked to me as a hardcore nationalist, not of the high nationalism of today, but a nationalist. He was a patriot. He was fighting for India in London before 1947, and looked after Indian interests. To the British, he looked like a Rasputin, evil incarnate. Why did you think that Menon was such a fascinating chapter to write? He's almost forgotten in this country.
Yes, I think he is a fascinating character, and I think you've touched on a really important point, that it sort of, I think I spent a chapter on Menon because I think he exemplifies that trend within British and American foreign policy and diplomacy, particularly in South Asia, in terms of exaggerating a communist threat and not really understanding Indian nationalism. So obviously Menon goes back to the India League. He spends a lot of time in London in the 1930s. He's very friendly with Nehru. He's absolutely a passionate nationalist. Now, he does align himself with left-wing groups while he's in India and has interactions with the British Communist Party. But that, I think, is largely a marriage of convenience. Those individuals groups and communist groups, socialist groups in the United Kingdom, for example, are useful to Menon because they offer public support, they offer logistical support, they offer financial support at sometimes. But that doesn't mean Menon's a communist. But I think you're right in that sort of in the febrile atmosphere of the 1950s and 1960s in the West, anyone who had any association with a socialist party or a communist party was immediately cast under suspicion as being a sort of a closet communist, really. And so I think in Britain, MI5, the British Security Service, in the United States, the Central Intelligence Agency, really had this exaggerated, overblown, paranoid fear that Menon was an agent of influence for the Soviet Union, was doing their bidding. I think that's nonsense. I think, you know, from all the information I've found, that Menon, as you said, is much more of a nationalist than he is a communist. And I think that's interesting because it speaks to a similar trend if we think about Southeast Asia and Indochina and the American attitude towards nationalists in those sort of theatres. It's a very similar pattern that's repeated in India. But I think so far people haven't really emphasised that fact, and the fact that this is a global sort of problem for the United States and Western powers in their inability to engage in a sophisticated and nuanced way with nationalism as opposed to communism. And I think that's happening in India at the same time. And Menon is the sort of classic example, I think, of British and American diplomats misreading and misunderstanding Indian nationalism as opposed to communism, and also misunderstanding Indian agency, which I think is one of the key things that comes out of the book. This notion that Menon would be a puppet of the Soviet Union and would do its bidding, and they could pull his strings and get him to do whatever he wanted, is just fanciful. Menon was a proud Indian, a proud nationalist. He was not going to do another country's bidding. His primary aim was to advance Indian interests, certainly not Soviet or communist interests. If he could work with the Communist Party in India, either in India or outside India, to achieve his aims, then I think he was pragmatic enough to do so. So I think lots of intelligence stories have pointed to the fact that there is evidence, some evidence, for example, that the KGB at various points in the 1970s may have given funding to some of Menon's parliamentary election campaigns. May well be true, but it doesn't mean Menon's a communist. Menon also would have taken money from the West, as many Indian politicians did. And I think part of my book is, I think Indians are very adept at playing West off against East during the Cold War and taking what they can from them. And so if we're thinking about agency, I think Indian agency is really, really important. And Indians are generally very sophisticated and effective at managing and manipulating that tension between East and West during the Cold War to India's advantage and to a nationalist advantage. So I think Menon encapsulates that story really, and I found him a fascinating character.
Yeah, well, it didn't help that he was a Serbic kind of man who did not suffer fools gladly. So it didn't help. I hope, with a book like yours and perhaps other contributions, a younger generation discovers a man like him, because he's a fascinating character in terms of India's political trajectory. Again, sticking with Menon's time, there is one place where you mentioned that Nehru used to be very, very angry with his intelligence agencies because they did not want to study Russian, i.e., go to Russia and learn how to work with the KGB. I presume that was what it would mean, and consider looking at Soviet Union and going into Soviet society and trying to understand it. But they all wanted to go to London and Washington, but what strikes me is that there was cooperation between Indian and Western agencies at a time when Indian politicians were criticizing interference all the time. Were they defying orders, or was it with the nod of the political masters?
It's an excellent point. Thank you. I think there is a tension between sovereignty and security in India, which begins in 1947 and the partition of the subcontinent. This need to have a really effective intelligence service. But the British bequeathing India, the transfer of intelligence power in India was lamentable, and the British did not leave India with a functioning intelligence service when they left in 1947, at the very time when India most needed a functioning intelligence service to head off communal tension and to the effects of partition, mass migration, political upheaval. India really needed an effective intelligence service in 1947, and the British did not give India that. So it's one of the sort of lamentable legacies of the transfer of power. It wasn't effective in intelligence terms. It was handled over a very short period of time and in a very unsatisfactory manner. I think that then led to the issue where India was constantly feeling, or Indian intelligence services, that they need to rely on external support to make sure that their intelligence service got up to speed during the Cold War, given the threats they were facing, particularly from Communist China, but also from Pakistan and other sort of regional. So I think Nehru has a conflicted relationship with intelligence, and it's a fascinating relationship that I'd like to explore in more depth. I mean, I think Nehru and Indira Gandhi both publicly clear that their attitude to intelligence is really complicated and it's conflicted. On one hand, they've grown up in a colonial environment where the British security and intelligence services have made their lives and their families' lives a misery. They've been subject to oppressive surveillance, and mail's been open, and been harassed and followed by British colonial intelligence services. So to some extent, that's coloured their sort of relationship or attitude towards intelligence, and the extent to which it can be misused and abused. I think in the 50s and 60s, Nehru is very conscious and says this to be a Malik, the Indian intelligence officer on them. You need to behave inappropriately. When he finds out that Malik, for example, is surveilling people that Nehru thinks shouldn't be subject to surveillance, he's really critical of Malik and the intelligence bureau. So Nehru understands he needs an intelligence bureau, he needs good intelligence. He just wants to operate on a really high ethical level and high ethical way, and doesn't want Indians to be subject to the same repressive methods that he experienced himself as an individual and a political agitator. So Nehru's often saying, look, Malik, you may think this guy's may be problematic, but so was I in the 1930s. And look what happened to me. I don't want this to be replicated in India in the 50s and 60s. So there is that sort of issue, I think. But I think Nehru is well aware of what's happening and the extent to which Malik is collaborating, cooperating with both MI5 and the Central Intelligence Agency. And I think he's cautious about that. But I think Nehru, again, is being pragmatic in terms of, as long as India has a semblance of control over that relationship, then he's relatively okay with it, because he understands that pragmatically India needs the expertise, the training, the logistical support from the Western intelligence terms, particularly in relation to China, and as the Chinese threat grows throughout the 1950s. So Nehru's, I think, aware of what's going on. But it's this question of plausible deniability, isn't it? With the US presidents, for example, the fact that presidents often do know about what's going on and approve it, but there's no written record to show they did, just so they've got that plausible deniability, and they can distance themselves from intelligence activity if it proves particularly politically problematic. So I think plausible deniability is absolutely going on under the Nehru administration in the 1950s and 1960s, and he's well aware of what's happening. He does express some reservations. So he says to Malik at certain points, I know what you're doing with the Central Intelligence Agency and British intelligence. I know they're offering you training. I know that's, and logistical support, and you've got a liaison relationship with them. That's fine. I'm okay with that. What I'm not okay with is, what is the CIA doing in India that they aren't telling you about? And Nehru, again, is a sophisticated enough political operator to know that the CIA, although they're helping India on one side, are also probably doing stuff that they aren't telling Malik and the IB about on the other side. So Nehru's, I think, Nehru's a very intelligent individual, very sophisticated politician, deeply experienced. He sort of knows what's going on. So I think he's trying to keep a sort of a wary eye on that relationship and how it evolves, really.
Speaking of Nehru intelligence during Nehru's time and cooperation between intelligence agencies, you talk about the planting of two nuclear devices in the Himalayas, I think, Nanda Devi and Nanda Kot, which were there to spy on the Chinese, and the revelation came only in late 1970s, 1978, when Morarji Desai mentioned it in Parliament, that there were two devices. And the worry at that stage was also not just the fact that CIA had planted two nuclear devices, but also that they could pollute the Ganges. So how did that play out?
So yeah, it's a really interesting story, and I think the genesis of that goes back to the Sino-Indian War of 1962. And after 1962, or during 1962, the United States and the United Kingdom do offer India military support, and part of that military support package is offering them intelligence support. So formally, India begins to get a much closer and more expanded relationship with the Central Intelligence Agency, but also British intelligence as well. So, for example, MI6 has been sort of kicked out of India by Nehru's government in the late 1940s, because it doesn't see why British secret intelligence should operate within India and conduct espionage, etc., and intelligence collection. So MI6 gets booted out of India in the late 1940s, but they come back at the invitation of the Indian government in 1964. And they do that because India's really worried about China, and he wants British intelligence support against China during that period. So part of that intelligence collection process that really begins in earnest in 1962 involves the use of U-2 spy planes, for example, which fly from bases in Odisha in eastern India and fly over the Himalayas and surveil Chinese both troop movements on the border, but also their nuclear test sites in Xinjiang. And also partly it's to do with the placement of these nuclear powered monitoring devices We had, as you said rightly, a place in Nandakot and Nanda Devi in the 1960s, a joint team of American and Indian mountaineers scale those two peaks and try to put these nuclear monitoring devices on the top of them. They get a clear view from the top of those peaks across the Himalayas and into sort of into eastern China, where they can monitor the nuclear test sites and missile ranges of communist China from the 1960s onwards. One of those packs is successfully put on the top of one of the mountains. It operates successfully, and it's successfully removed after 3 or 4 years. A second one is lost as they're trying to haul it up the mountain and install it. There's a snow squall, there's a storm, they can't get the mountain pack up there. They think it falls into a crevasse on the mountain and it's unrecoverable. And so they sort of just write it off. And it doesn't, the story doesn't sort of goes dead. No one really knows about it. And it doesn't really surface, as you say, until 1978, when an American journalist breaks the story in an American newspaper. Quickly that gets replayed in India about this notion that a nuclear power pack may have been lost in the Himalayas in a secret CIA Indian operation back in the 1960s. And absolutely right, the notion that it might have leaked plutonium into the Ganges and polluted the river Ganges is really problematic. I think it plays out in interesting ways. And I think, interestingly, the fact that the Morarji Desai government is in place there and not Indira Gandhi's government is really significant. So I think had Indira Gandhi still been in power at the point when these revelations occurred, I think there would have been a massive attempt to sort of hush them up and keep them quiet and sort of kill the story. But because Morarji Desai's government, the Janata government, is in power at the time, they are quite open about it, surprisingly so, I think. So Morarji Desai goes before Parliament and decides the best thing to do is to exercise a mea culpa. The notion that openness is the best disinfectant, and that he should go forward and just say, look, we absolutely did this, we cooperated with the CIA. So there's a big clamour in India when the story first comes out that, oh, this is the CIA up to no good again. They've conducted this operation and India doesn't know about it, and this is what they're doing in India. And Morarji Desai says quite clearly, no, we knew exactly what was happening. We cooperated with the Central Intelligence Bureau, the Central Intelligence Agency, the IB, the Intelligence Bureau, were an active participant in this operation. So we did it willingly with America, and we did it because of the threat posed by China. So there's a national security issue which overrode this notion of not wanting to cooperate with the Central Intelligence Agency. So he goes before Parliament, makes a public statement, quite open about it. And interestingly, the Americans don't want him to do that. So the American government says, we really want you to hush this up. We don't want you to tell the Indian people what's happened. We want you to keep this as quiet as you possibly can. And Morarji Desai, to his credit, says, no, I'm not going to do that. I want, this needs to be told to the Indian people what's happened and why. And this is the best way of dealing with the story. And he goes very open, very candid, makes a public statement on it. And in retrospect, actually, the Americans think this is a really good idea, because they think it actually kills the story. Most people are reasonable and they think, well, actually, there is a rationale for doing that. It does make sense in terms of China and the threat posed by China. So we're willing to accept it. And the story sort of dies really because of that. So interestingly, again, an episode where the United States is urging India to take a particular course of action and putting India under tremendous pressure to do so. But the Desai government says, we're not going to do that. We're going to exercise our own judgment. We think this is the best course. And in retrospect, American diplomats come back and say, no, actually, India got it right. They did it the right way. It was the right way to handle this intelligence story. And so it's quite an interesting example, again, of Indian agency. So is the Central Intelligence Agency able to tell India what to do during the Cold War? No, it's not, clearly. India has agency, and when it feels it's in its national interest to exercise that agency, it doesn't shirk from doing so. So I think that's a really important lesson that comes out of this nuclear story.
Indira Gandhi, to go back to what I said in the introduction, Indira Gandhi was a very strident critic of the foreign hand, which she says was out to get her. And was operating in India, but she also made it a point to say that they were out to get her. I'm going to put it this way. In 1973, Salvatore Allende was killed by, or was ousted from power by Augusto Pinochet in Chile. 2 years later, Mujibur Rahman in Bangladesh was killed. At least in the Chilean case, it's well known that the CIA backed Pinochet. We don't know about the Bangladeshi. This may not have been. So can you blame her for being paranoid?
No, I think that comes.
Both of them, sorry, let me just finish this. Both of them were socialists and nationalists. So can you really blame her?
No, I think there is. So I think, again, Indira Gandhi's relationship with Western intelligence and even with Soviet intelligence is quite complicated and quite nuanced. And so, again, Indira Gandhi is trying to be pragmatic and take what intelligence support she can from the West and from the Soviet Union, doing so in a way that doesn't compromise Indian sovereignty. So I think Gandhi is well aware of what the CIA are up to in India, and to some extent has used what the CIA is doing in the 1950s, or has been doing in the 1950s and 1960s, as a politically expedient tool in the 1970s to blame, a slump in the Indian economy, inflation, as you mentioned, bus strikes or railway strikes or cyclones in Orissa, on the Central Intelligence Agency. So there is a sense in which Indira Gandhi is using intelligence for politically opportunistic means to deflect criticism of her regime and administration domestically by blaming the foreign hand. That certainly is happening, I think. But at the same time, in parallel to that, I think her fears about the Central Intelligence Agency wanting to promote regime change in India do have a basis, are sort of justified and are rational. The Nixon administration particularly has tilted towards Pakistan in 1971 during the war that brings Bangladesh into being. You mentioned Ali, absolutely right. That's public knowledge that Ali has been, or at least the Central Intelligence Agency, have cooperated and collaborated with forces, right-wing forces in Chile that have removed Ali from power. Obviously, Ali dies in that coup, and Ramana again in Bangladesh. So I think there is a sense in which Gandhi's paranoia is justified by events across the global south during that period. And I think here, one of the things that I emphasize and that comes out, I try to make clear in my book, is the importance of South-South intelligence liaison. So we often hear about intelligence liaison between the West, the Central Intelligence Agency, the British and India, or the East and the Soviet Union and India. What we hear less about is India's intelligence connections with fellow countries in the global south. So I think one of the things that's driving Indira Gandhi's paranoia about Nixon administration and its potential willingness to remove her from power in a coup or in some sort of insurrection is that she's talking to fellow leaders in the global south, and they are reinforcing and amplifying her fears. So she talks to Salvador Allende. She knows his fears about what the United States may or may not be doing in Chile. Interestingly, once Allende is killed, his wife and daughter they go to New Delhi, and they speak to Gandhi. They're welcomed as honoured guests by the Indian government. And you can only imagine what Allende's wife and daughter, the conversations they're having with Indira Gandhi on the basis of they are convinced that the Central Intelligence Agency has been heavily implicated in the death of Allende. So they will be reinforcing and amplifying Gandhi's fears. Similarly, she has quite a close relationship at various points with Fidel Castro, the Cuban leader. Interestingly, the day that Allende's assassination is announced in the global press, Fidel Castro is in Delhi and he's having dinner with Indira Gandhi. So you can imagine the conversation. I mean, Castro has repeatedly tried to be assassinated. I mean, CIA have tried to assassinate Castro repeatedly during the 1960s and early 1970s in a whole series of bizarre plots which never succeed. So she's having dinner with Castro. You can only imagine what Castro is telling her about Central Intelligence Agency and how they might be trying to do Indira Gandhi down, and talking about all the examples where the CIA has tried to do exactly the same thing to him over the last decade or so. So there is, I think, really strong reasons why Gandhi is not being irrational and is not being unreasonable in suspecting, or at least believing, that this is a real possibility. I think that's also amplified by the fact that she goes to the American embassy in New Delhi in 1973 and actually says to them, in clear terms, face to face, is the United States government trying to undermine and overthrow the Allende government? Were they involved in the events in Chile? And she makes that absolutely explicit. And the ambassador's not there, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, he's back in Washington at the time. But the number two in the American embassy, the charge d'affaires, confronts Indira Gandhi and says to her face, we have nothing to do with the events in Chile. They are absolutely, the CIA is not involved in Chile. A month later, she sends on a television set, and William Colby, the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, is testifying before the American Congress saying, we have spent hundreds of thousands, not millions of dollars trying to overthrow the Allende regime. So what does Gandhi think? I've been lied to.
That was an undiplomatic move by the charge.
It was. So I think you can understand how that may have reinforced this sense in Gandhi that I cannot trust the Nixon administration. I cannot trust that they're not trying to undermine socialist regimes across the global south that don't fit in with their worldview. So I think it's perfectly reasonable in retrospect to understand why Indira Gandhi might have been genuinely concerned that the Nixon administration was trying to overthrow. And incidentally as well, the Soviet leaders are also telling her the same thing, I think mischievously, but they are feeding Gandhi information, basically saying, look, we have intelligence that Nixon is trying to do this. So she's getting intelligence from multiple points that appear to corroborate this notion of regime change in India on the part of the United States. So yeah, I think, Gandhi, I think on one hand is definitely exaggerating the CIA threat in India for domestic political purposes. But on the other hand, I think she has good reason to suspect that personally, she may be in the crosshairs of the Nixon administration in the early 1970s.
Okay, your book is really fascinating. I could go on and on, but I'm just going to ask a couple of more questions. One is that in this day of social media, proliferation of television and satellites, has spying changed, and B, is there any point spying because you're getting all the information all around you?
Really good point. And so there are ongoing debates, I think, in intelligence circles about, for example, the National Security Agency in the United States, GCHQ in the United Kingdom, and signals intelligence agencies, that because of the social media age and the advent of the internet, are hoovering up huge amounts of information. All our telephone communications, all our texts, all our internet traffic is being intercepted by these spy agencies in huge programs. So the argument goes, well, if all this information is being collected, then surely intelligence agencies know from the digital realm everything they need to know about what's happening. I think most intelligence practitioners and professionals argue that that is a really important and growing component of intelligence, but it's not the entire picture. So if we have a jigsaw puzzle of intelligence, maybe 100 pieces out of a 120-piece jigsaw puzzle are technical intelligence and signals intelligence, but you still need those few pieces that are human intelligence to plug into the jigsaw to make the picture make sense. I'll give you a good example of this in an Indian context. When India tested its first nuclear device in the early 1970s, a peaceful nuclear explosion, the Central Intelligence Agency missed that nuclear explosion. And they missed that nuclear explosion for a number of reasons. One, because Indian intelligence under R.N. Kaur was extremely clever and sophisticated and adept at concealing the preparations for that test. So they didn't use open phone lines. All communication was handled in a way that was very difficult for American technically to intercept those communications. So nothing was put over the airwaves. Very, very sophisticated security operation mounted by the Research Analysis Wing and Indian scientists to conceal the preparations for that test. They were also really effective at knowing when American spy satellites were flying over India. When they were flying over, they camouflaged the preparations for that nuclear test. So photographs the Americans were receiving really gave no indication that those tests were going to take place. The only way that could have been discovered was if the CIA had an agent inside the Indian nuclear program, a human asset, in other words. And whenever an intelligence failure occurs, there's always an inquiry. The CIA had a big inquiry after the nuclear explosion in the 1970s in India and said, well, how did we get it so disastrously wrong? How could we not tell the president this was going to happen and give them any warning? And the principal conclusion of that entire report and inquiry was because we didn't have enough human assets in India. India technically was able to frustrate our intelligence collection. They were able to frustrate the satellite intelligence collection. What we needed was an agent inside the Indian nuclear program to tell us what was really happening. So it's just a point of emphasis that you can have all the technical intelligence in the world, but on certain occasions, in certain scenarios, you still need that human agent inside a government, inside a program to tell you what's really happening. So I think it's a really crucial point, and signals intelligence, internet intelligence will become much more important over time, but it's never going to be the entire picture, I don't think.
I'm coming back to the point I made in the beginning when you mentioned the relationship between George Bush, the vice president and ex-CIA director, and R.N. Kaur, the RAW director. They were friends, and when George Bush came to India, they met privately. But when it came to particularly particularly such a delicate issue of Punjab, and the Americans were saying things that India did not like. I think Cow let them know it. So that bit of tension was always there between two friends representing two intelligence agencies.
Yeah, it's a fascinating relationship. Sort of George Bush was obviously director of the Central Intelligence Agency in the 1970s for a brief period of time before he became vice president for Ronald Reagan and then eventually president of the United States. So he's one of some presidents have really sophisticated and deep knowledge of intelligence. George Bush was one of those. Other presidents are less interested in intelligence and don't really have a strong background in intelligence. I think Bush was really important because he had established that close relationship with R. and Cow when he was director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And like many Western intelligence officials and leaders, and also Western diplomats, Cowell was held in huge respect by George Bush for his ability as an intelligence officer. I think many in the American establishment felt Cowell was at the very sort of, one of the best intelligence officers in the world. He was someone who was deeply respected for his professional abilities, but also for his personal abilities. People trusted, I think, R. Cow in ways that other intelligence officers from foreign powers weren't trusted. So that relationship with George Bush was actually quite deep. It was quite, it was a very strong relationship between the two. But you're absolutely right; it did not supersede the national interest of either party. So at certain points, George Bush in the 1980s, when Indira Gandhi was making great play of a foreign hand in the Punjab and how they were stoking up the Khalistan movement and creating problems for India, Bush was wrote very candidly to R. Cow saying, look, we are not doing this. I've told you we're not doing it. I can give you my guarantee this is not happening. We are not fomenting or stirring up insurrection and agitation in the Punjab. I give you my word this is happening. And so this exchange is going on between the two officials. And R. Cow, I think, is relating that back to Indira Gandhi. But Gandhi's, at that time, it's very politically convenient for the Gandhi government to lay the most of the blame for what's happening in the Punjab on a foreign hand or on external powers. So I think Bush is frustrated by that. I think one of the things it does tell us is that the importance of back channels and intelligence. So at that point, I think, it was very difficult for the Indian government to, on a sort of ambassadorial level or a sort of prime minister or presidential level, to have that frank level of communication. But between intelligence officials who had a really strong relationship, it was perfectly possible. And we can see that today in the Middle East with Bill Burns going around speaking to various sort of leaders, intelligence colleagues throughout the Middle East, and given the current crisis that's developing. Intelligence as a communication channel, as a back channel outside of normal diplomacy can be incredibly important. And I think India emphasizes this in 1971. So even when, in 1971, when the Nixon administration tilts decisively towards Pakistan, in the war that occurred in 1971, R. Cow makes a point of keeping that intelligence communication channel open to Washington. So while Gandhi and the Indian government have real problems communicating with the Nixon administration, and the sort of relationship between the two is effectively broken down, the spies within the two countries, R. Cow and his equivalent in the CIA, are still talking to each other all the time. So that very rarely does the intelligence channel get shut down, even if the sort of at the political level, relations between states are in a real sense of crisis. And I think that's really emphasized by the Punjab in the 1980s, but also in 1971. Lots of evidence from the US archives from intelligence officials saying that we were still talking to India in 1971, but we were doing it through intelligence channels. We weren't doing it through diplomatic channels. And I think that's in terms of crisis, that's really important.
Yeah, that's a nice note to kind of wind up on, because that tells you fundamentally that your book has looked at that theme extremely closely, that back channel conversations always go on. India learned a lot formally and otherwise from the Western agencies. And at the same time, uh, political leaders were not particularly happy about the involvement of, as they should be, uh, intelligence agencies in India. As you said, MI6 got kicked out of the country and was brought back. CIA helped India plant nuclear device, nuclear listening device. So I think that will go on, and that tells you that the spying world is a world of its own. I like the way you opened your book. I wanted to say this at the very end. I like the way you opened your book with the example of Carla being in a Delhi jail and George Smiley coming and meeting him. So I think that shadowy world is continues to fascinate us, whether it is in fiction or in real life. Real life must be even more fascinating. So, thank you very much, Paul, Dr. Paul McGarr, who's our guest, who has just given us a fascinating tour of the world of spies in India and elsewhere during the Cold War. I think that's very important to know because during the Cold War, India, as we said, was a critical theater of conflict and cooperation in among agencies from around the world. Thank you very much for being a part of Wire Talk.